McQuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McQuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
You know, either the United States won the Cold War with Russia, or, as former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright says, Russia lost it. The fact remains that relations between Russia and the U.S. have heated up. Co-hosting this program with me is Jim Falk, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, who recently interviewed some key experts on these issues. And Jim, what are the stakes that we're looking at foreign policy right now?
Well, this is certainly a key time with relations between the United States and Russia. And in fact, with the Mueller report just being released, it appears to really exonerate President Trump. So I think one of the questions we'll want to address today, does this open up a new pathway?
Well, our guest joining us, David Oualaalou, is geopolitical consultant, award-winning educator, former D.C. international security analyst, and founder of Global Perspective Consulting. His latest book is Beneath the Veil, The Fall of the House of Saud, and his forthcoming book, which we're looking forward to, David, The Russian Roulette, Russia's Infiltration of American Society. We're excited about that, so thank you for coming to the program.
My pleasure.
And sitting next to you is Robert Donaldson. He's Trustees Professor of Political Science. He's Emeritus at the University of Tulsa, where he served as president from 1990 to 1996. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author or co-author of 6 books, including his latest, which you'll see, and it's laying here on the table, The Foreign Policy of Russia, Changing Systems, Enduring Interest. Bob, welcome to the program.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you. And Jim, you interviewed a couple of people. Talk to us about who they were, and let's hear from one of them right now.
Well, I did, Dennis. And in fact, the first program at the World Affairs Council this year was with Ambassador McFaul, who had been ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014, and is the author of another book, From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia. And I asked him, how was it that Boris Yeltsin selected Vladimir Putin, really out of obscurity? So let's hear what he has to say.
Good.
Why did Boris Yeltsin elevate Putin to prime minister rather than pick someone from the political class? Also, did he really understand what he was getting?
Great question, and I don't know the answer to your second part, right? Mm-hmm. But Putin's a completely accidental president, to your point. I actually met him in the spring of 1991. I've known Putin for a long time. Not sure we're Facebook friends anymore. Maybe we are, given what goes on Facebook. But I met him when he was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Mm-hmm. He worked for a very charismatic figure, Anatoly Sobchak was his name. But he was just a bureaucrat. He was in charge of international affairs, and I was there with an American NGO doing democracy work, by the way, at the invitation of Sobchak.
Which he remembers.
Which he does remember. He remembers well. Yeah. But we were there at the invitation of his boss. But I tell you that story because he was always around the political class. He was never a political leader. And when Sobchak lost an election, by the way, that doesn't happen very often in these days, but Putin was without a job, and he approached his friends working for Yeltsin in Moscow. And that's how he showed up in Moscow and worked as kind of mid-level bureaucrat in the Kremlin. He doesn't want people to remember that. Right? He wants to say there was the Yeltsin era, which was horrible, and then I came and saved Russia. But he, for several years, worked for Boris Yeltsin. But he was not the heir apparent, to your question. There's another guy, Boris Nemtsov was his name. Yeltsin had picked him to succeed him. He was a mayor in a town called Nizhny Novgorod, had been elected twice, was a charismatic, Western-leaning guy. He was a good friend of mine before being assassinated in 2015. Everybody knew that was the plan. So Nemtsov came from Nizhny Novgorod, became the first deputy prime minister, and was being cultivated. And then 1998, there was a financial crash, you may remember, because it wasn't just in Russia. It was all over the world. It didn't start in Russia, but it had giant economic negative consequences in Russia. And the government was forced to resign as a result of that. And Yeltsin couldn't get a liberal candidate through the parliament. And that's when he chose Putin, and he became a prime minister. Not approval rating, his recognition rating at the time he became prime minister was 5%.
Amazing.
95% didn't know who he was. And then he chose him, I think, out of stability reasons, but I think the consequences were not what Yeltsin intended.
And Bob, when that happened, we never thought, I suppose, that Vladimir Putin would be in power as long as he has been, and I'm not sure when the end of his reign may be, but at one point there really was this reset, and it appeared that U.S. and Russia relations would be much more favorable than they are now. What happened?
Well, what happened is that Putin estimated that some kind of partnership originally, he even tried a partnership in 2001 with President George W. Bush. But he estimated that that would bring Russia back to the table as a respected great power, and that the United States and Russia could accomplish some things that they had in common, in interests in common, but also that some of Russia's concerns would be addressed. And when they weren't, and when the U.S. went on to invade Iraq and make further expansion of NATO, Putin was alienated. Obama tried to overcome that with the reset. Michael McFaul certainly played a large role in that. So you're saying somewhat we're responsible for some of these issues? I absolutely do believe that, and I think that it's wrong, in my opinion, to characterize Putin as anti-Western and Yeltsin somehow as very different. I think both of them had as their paramount interest restoring Russia as a great power.
Yep. And David, you have a response to that, I'm sure?
Well, certainly, I'll concur with Bob regarding his assertion, because there is this thinking in Washington, this establishment, that we're going to have to identify the enemy, the Russians. Now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the dynamics have changed on the global stage. You know, foreign policy realism has always been some sort of between the diagnosis and prescription of how nation states behave in a chaotic international system. But at the same time, they're going to have to think in terms of how they formulate policy. And Russia falls within that, because we didn't keep our promises when the Soviet Union ended.
And specifically?
Specifically with that, for example, we said that we are not going to move an inch eastward. This is the quote of President Bush, and yet we expanded west. Russia didn't interpret that as, Russia never thought of America as a partner. But when we embarked on enlarging NATO eastward, they're going to have to think in terms of, we can't partner with the Americans.
And the reunification of Germany played a big role as well.
Which it did indeed, because the thinking was, well, we're going to reunify based on what Gorbachev said, that we're going to assist with the free trade, we're going to assist with the economy. We have not done that. And the Russians look at like, why the Americans are going back on their words? And yet, they embarked on us, for example, support the UN Security Council resolution as far as even Libya, Iraq, even for the counterterrorism in Afghanistan. But all of a sudden, we took a different path. And that's where the Russian tensions come from.
Yeah, and Bob, we talk about these relations. A lot of these relations with Russia have been with treaties of different kinds. Give us some sense of the history of treaties and bring us on up to kind of where we are today with the treaty issue.
Well, the treaties really, I think, began in the Nixon era in the period of détente, but they continued with Ronald Reagan. And there were important arms control agreements that were made. There were, in the Nixon period, there were more understandings about how in that very tense time of nuclear confrontation, the two sides should behave. But those understandings and those treaties really didn't survive the Cold War. Well, the treaties did, but now, of course, they are being disavowed. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty just President Trump said that the U.S. is going to withdraw within 6 months, and Mr. Putin said the Russians will do that too. But also the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the START Treaty, which was a reduction of strategic arms, it will expire. It was negotiated by George W. Bush and Putin, and that is going to expire. Originally this first START, and then the Obama administration extended it, and now it'll expire in 2021 unless there is an effort, and I think there really should be, to keep it in place, because these treaties have really had a major role in governing the strategic relationship and the nuclear standoff between two former superpowers that both have superpower in the nuclear realm.
But Bob, let me ask you this. How much of our withdrawal from the INF has to do with our relations with Russia versus the new stature of China?
Well, and that's a very good point. Obviously, we've chafed under the restrictions because China is not part of that, and the short-range and nuclear-range missiles that we're not allowed to develop and deploy would be of very great use in the Pacific theater as well. But rather than simply withdraw from the treaty, I think the better approach might have been to suggest a broadening of that treaty, making it a multilateral rather than bilateral engagement. But right now it appears that there is an arms race in that nuclear short-range and medium-range missile category that's about to happen.
I had the opportunity 30 years ago on our first television program to interview the late Senator John Tower, who negotiated some of these treaties in the late 1980s, and he was talking about the interesting negotiations with the Russians, to say the least. And so the treaty issue is one of the things that you interviewed Madeleine Albright about. And so we've got a clip, which is clip 13, and part of the interview we did with Madeleine Albright about these treaties. So when we're ready, let's run that clip.
Yeah, let's
please.
listen to that now.
We also have begun to establish a whole kind of arms control network. I mean, starting with the SALT Treaty and the START Treaty, and very important ways of limiting each other's power, talking about mutually assured destruction, any number of different ways that the American nuclear doctrine and the Soviet nuclear doctrine responded to each other. So the truth is that there had been questions as to whether the Russians were living up to the INF Treaty. And this was something that came up in the Obama administration, and there really had been questions and pushing on it. I do think that the Russians were not living up to it, but by withdrawing from it, as we signaled, it gives the Russians an excuse to say, well, okay, you're out of it, why should we get involved in it? And so I think there are ways that you deal with cheating in these arms control treaties. It happens in a bunch of them, but there is a process that takes place, and by withdrawing, I think we have undercut the system.
Bob, one of the questions I always like to ask some of our specialists on Russia is this. Is the United States government pursuing a different policy than the President of the United States?
The answer to that is yes. I use the image from Dr. Doolittle of the Yama that's going in two directions, the push me, pull you, because the President, and this was most notable in the Helsinki press conference after the summit, the President stresses close personal relations and opportunities for engagement. The government, however, and that includes both the Congress and the large part of the national security bureaucracy, are focused on sanctions and on trying to rein in Russian behavior, and are not interested or optimistic about any new kind of cooperative arrangements. So you really do have right now a conflict, and whether you are in favor of President Trump's other policies or not, in my view, he's right in his instincts to think that there are opportunities for the two sides to cooperate on very important issues like nuclear stability, counter-terrorist cooperation, counter-proliferation terrorist cooperation, and so forth.
Well, then let's hear what Ambassador McFaul says, because I asked him, what does he mean when he says we are now in the period of hot peace? Let's listen to clip number 19. So this seems like, in a way, a period that's more hostile and less communication. Is my perception valid?
Your perception is definitely valid. We can go through, as I do in the book, about how things are similar and different, right? Because some things are similar, some things are different. Well, and that's deliberately why I use hot peace to echo the Cold War, but the difference. But to your precise point, I actually think it's worse than the Cold War. That the number of exchanges, the number of dialogues, the government-to-government relations are worse. And that's scary because we're going to have disagreements with Russia and other countries. That's a normal part of international politics, as you well know. But we can't have disagreements based on misunderstandings or bad information. And I worry that in today's moment, that could happen because of the lack of engagement that we have.
So David, what's the solution to the problem we just talked about?
I wish I have that magic answer. It's not an easy matter. It's not an easy matter because what we say versus what we do are two different things. The Russians are interpreting that from that perspective. You go back, for example, to when Dmitry Medvedev was the president, and during his negotiations with Obama, that there were some stride made forward, some progress of sort, especially with 4 items, with the START, with the arms control, with the trade, and with the counterintelligence, cooperation between the two. The moment Vladimir Putin ascended to power, that reset button was at its end. So it's not easy because there is no trust. Well, one of the issues that I believe certainly to pave the way for a conversation with the Russians is at least we need to engage in a debate. A setting like this will be important to bring in new ideas, something that has not been considered before as to how we can bridge that gap.
Well, President
If
Trump
I can,
yes,
Dennis, let me disagree on one point. David said when Vladimir Putin returned to power. Vladimir Putin was always in power. He was sitting over in the position of vice president, or the premier.
Prime Minister.
Nominally the second in command, but he was still in command. Dmitry Medvedev was his protege. And so what happened during the reset, with one exception, and that was Medvedev's agreement not to veto the Western involvement and the Arab involvement that brought down Gaddafi in Libya. But with that exception, everything else that happened was with Putin's consent. Putin came back to power, and things didn't change because he was back to power. Things changed because he perceived a continuing pressure on the part of the Western powers to try not only to expand NATO to Georgia and to Ukraine, but to continue to create disaffection in what the Russians used to call the near abroad, the former Soviet states.
Well, I was going to say, you're right about that, but I think McFaul in his book did talk about the ability of Americans to negotiate with Medvedev a lot better than he could with Putin, for sure. And then in Jim's interview, the podcast with McFaul, Ambassador McFaul, he asked him this question about what happened in Helsinki, and that was just, I think, was that last year, Jim?
Yeah, it was last July. Yeah.
And let's just say that Ambassador McFaul has a very personal interest in what was said there. But you may recall that President Trump was there, and he basically disavowed what the national security state said. So if we're ready, let's run number 18, clip number 18 from Mike McFaul.
So where were you during the Helsinki summit of last July? Let's just remind everybody what happened. President Trump suggested, he even volunteered that the Russian government could interrogate, question you.
Yes.
Where were you when you heard of this, and what first came to your mind?
I actually was in Helsinki. I work for NBC News, and so we had a big team there.
Yeah.
And in the NBC News world, we were live on TV listening to that press conference, and my job is to provide the analysis. And just to remind your listeners, the big news out of Helsinki that we focused on that day was not about me. It was about President Trump's agreeing with Putin and disagreeing with our intelligence community about what Russia had done in 2016. So that's where the real focus was. But on live TV, I'm there, watching with Lester Holt. We're watching the news, figuring out what to say when Putin floats this idea and President Trump says it's a great idea. And at the time, let me be honest, because it's on tape, I gave the president a pass. I was like, he obviously doesn't understand what Putin's doing here. He doesn't know what an MLAT treaty is. He doesn't know that we don't do this. They'll straighten this out. That'll be no big deal. And that's what I said.
He probably hasn't seen his diplomatic passport.
Good point. But the thing I didn't know at the time, that I was on the list. He just said a group of Americans. It was only on the flight back that next day to Helsinki to San Francisco. My plane had Wi-Fi, and I began to get literally dozens of pings from Russian journalists, not American journalists, asking me, what do I think of this idea that they not only wanted to interrogate me, but that day they made it clear that they wanted to indict me of a crime. And that's when it became serious. And unfortunately, the White House didn't come to bat for me and the rest of us right away. It took some pressure from the U.S. Senate and from the population before they finally got it right.
I remember that. You can only imagine his feelings listening to that when he was sitting on the set covering the summit. David, I want to ask you about Crimea, because as we talk about how we go forward, one of the major sticking points is Crimea, the annexation, which is just celebrated, if you wish, in Russia, its 5th year. Are we at a point now where we just have to recognize that's a fait accompli and move on?
Well, c'est un fait accompli d'ailleurs. It's a done deal because I don't see how the Russians will give that up again. It's because it's of a strategic interest. And also, we need to understand the history of Crimea, what it means to the Russians. And that's something we don't do well in America. Sort of, we don't read history much to understand why Russians moved forward with that plan. My big concern, Jim, is what comes after that, especially for the Baltic states. That's where my concern is regarding the Russian expansion that's going to be northward.
Go talk a little bit more about this.
The concern is, again, we're saying one thing and doing another. We want to hit and invade Iraq. The Russians look at it. Interesting enough that the Russians didn't oppose to that, knowing that down the road, we might turn the Russians might turn the tables around. That's why they want to hit with Crimea, because the U.S. was not. What else the U.S. is going to do? Trying to expand democracy in Russia and beyond? They're not going to allow that. So the concern that I see personally is that now with Crimea being secured, now with the presence of Russia in the Middle East, with in Syria, because now who's deciding in the Middle East? It's Syria, not the United States. So you can just see how the dynamics of global politics are changing that balance of power that the United States was the guard and we have shaped since World War II is changing.
Now, Bob, you've talked about the idea that Putin is supposed to step down in 2024. I read an article recently where the fine folks in their Politburo or Duma or legislature over there were trying to think about appointing him czar. I mean, what do you think the future is for Putin in Russia, and how's he doing at the moment?
Well, his popularity is down. It peaked when Crimea was annexed by Russia. There have been some difficult domestic issues, including increasing the retirement age and reducing the pensions that have stirred some trouble. Putin really has more trouble on the domestic front, given that the economy is not strong, than he does internationally, where Russians applaud his efforts to make Russia great again. But it is really, I think, a mistake to focus too much on Putin. He will be in office, all likelihood, until 2024. But the issue is, will Putinism continue? Will there be some kind of sharp turn? Because Putin is despite the fact that we talk about his great power and his endurance and so forth, he's part of a system. And there are other players in that system that have interests. And I think an interesting piece by Andrew Higgins, the Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times recently, where he raised the question about, do we focus too much on who the Russian president is and not enough on what Russia's larger systemic interests are?
But I think, if I may, Jim,
yeah.
I would have to disagree with you, Bob, on this
particular
particular point. It's just because if we are not focusing on Putin, who makes the decision? He's the only one who says you go this way or that way. I'll give you an example. Last year, actually only about 6 months ago, Putin stated, and I quote, that I am okay with the $60 a barrel of oil on the international market. I'm also ready for another currency beside the US dollar to conduct international transactions. You know, it wasn't the Russian oil establishment that said that, it was Putin himself, which at least I will interpret that as a trained analyst, that he's paving the way to pave that with the Chinese as far as, okay, maybe is it time to push the dollar away to kind of claim domination of sort? So the interest in Putin will have to persist in understanding what his next move is.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Chinese, because I recently read where the deputy foreign minister said the relations between China and Russia have never been better. So is it really a situation now, the friend of my friend is my enemy? Or
it is indeed. Jim, I wrote an article in 2015 claiming this particular point, that it will be just a matter of time for Russia and China, despite their strategic differences and interests and all that, they could join forces against the United States. Because Bob did mention this earlier, that we don't want, because the Russians thinking in terms, and Chinese also, we don't want US presence in Asia. We want to keep the United States bogged into the Middle East. So if they can join forces together, and I do see it happening on a small scale, this is not a strategic alliance. There's a possibility to that.
There's a lot of history there. I agree with David, we don't study it enough, but there's a lot of history and a lot of demographic concern on the part of the Russians that if they get into bed with the Chinese, they're going to be the junior partner and they're going to be outmaneuvered and outspent. And I think there's some hesitation about that. As I said, I don't think Putin is anti-Western. I think he's pro-Russian. And if relationships with the West can serve Russia's interests better than relationships with China, he'll take that bet.
So is he stirring up the pot internationally to distract from what's happening domestically?
There is a certain amount of that, and it's a tendency among Russian
We see it in the
rulers.
United States too.
In the United States.
Absolutely not, never.
Yes.
No,
But it's worked very well for him.
Well, it has, and as I said before, that's where his popularity base is Putin as a world figure and not Putin as a great master of the Russian economy.
Well, I remember well when George W. Bush, President Bush, looked into his eyes and saw his soul, as I recall. I'm
wants
not
to
sure if
forget
that
that he
was
did
soul, S-O-U-L, or S-O-L-E. I'm not sure which soul that was. And we just are out of time, but I want to thank you, David, and thank you, Bob, both for being here, and look forward to doing another program with you on sort of what Russia's interest is in the world, not necessarily just with the U.S., but where they're involved in other places, Syria and the Middle East and places like that, and as you mentioned, the Baltic. So thank you so much for joining us. You know, Jim and I hope that your understanding of Russia-U.S. relations has been enhanced, not only by the two guests, but by the two experts that Jim interviewed in the last few weeks as well. You know, watch for a follow-up program on Russia's relations with other countries. Follow us on Twitter. Check out our website at McQuistionTV.com and keep inviting us in to
talk about things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at NikkiMcQuistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.